Joining us now is Chief Economist at the IPA, Adam Creighton. Adam, thank you for joining us. The Australian federal election is just 4 days away now, and this campaign is going down as perhaps the most uninspiring that we've ever seen, and the standard has not been that high to begin with. Chris Uhlmann wrote a piece in The Australian over the weekend claiming that in 6 months from now, no one will recall any part of this campaign because not a single word adequately addresses a radically changing world. He goes on to say that this campaign says nothing and says it badly, words without wit, wisdom, metre or memory. And I couldn't agree more. Adam, you were covering the US election last year, which was just a blockbuster due to Donald Trump's brilliant campaign skills. I mean, how pathetic is our election campaign comparing it to America's? And what does it really say about our politicians and Australians?
Yeah, look, certainly the contrast is extraordinary with the US. Look, I think it's partly because of our compulsory voting system. That means that both the major parties need to target their message to the person in the middle who doesn't really care. And so you end up with a system that produces politicians that talk in slogans and sound bites and don't speak very deeply. But that said, even by Australian standards, I do think this campaign has just been dreadful. It's not the election Australia needs. You know, we're in a crisis of falling living standards. There's great geopolitical uncertainty. And you know, we're just talking about basically boosting house prices. That's the centerpiece of this election is you know, which party is going to boost house prices more, basically. That is somewhat depressing. Look, what are the structural reasons for this? It's hard to know why it's so bad. I mean, I think the coalition actually deserves more criticism here because it's just been Labor light, in my view, throughout the whole campaign. I mean, sure, if it's going to accept Labor's economic agenda, at least set the cultural agenda, which it's tried to do in the last few days of the campaign with the Welcome to Country stuff. And I think they should have come out a bit harder on that earlier because, you know, we just had a vote in this country on The Voice, which was overwhelmingly no. It was overwhelmingly a vote for unity. And I think the opposition leader could have tapped into that on Anzac Day and afterwards and you know, really won the last week. But, you know, he's tentatively done that. But if you look at the polls or the betting markets, let's face it, it's not looking great for the coalition at the moment on Saturday.
Yeah, and with the Welcome to Country stuff that you mentioned, Peter Dutton has declared that Indigenous Welcome to Country ceremonies are overdone and says that they cheapen the significance of what it was meant to do. And it appears the majority of Australians agree with Peter Dutton on this. The latest news.com.au poll found that 65% feel that Welcome to Country ceremonies should stop completely. Now, many Australians feel that they are tokenistic, they're overdone, and guess what? They do nothing to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. And of course, this reached boiling point during Anzac Day at the ceremony at the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, which was interrupted by booing from neo-Nazis, which of course was absolutely not appropriate at a service, which is meant to be a time for reflection. But many veterans have expressed how inappropriate it was for a Welcome to Country to be held at an Anzac Day service, many saying it was a slap in the face. And I agree with Peter Dutton. There is absolutely a sense across the community that Welcome to Country ceremonies are overdone. And the sad thing is that we're still talking about this issue and it takes away a really important conversation that should be had about how to actually improve outcomes for Indigenous Australians.
Yeah, certainly. Look, I was shocked, kind of generally the political and media class on Friday and the days afterwards. They were shocked that Australians might not want a Welcome to Country on Anzac Day, when as you've suggested, that's the majority view, certainly from that news.com poll. And I would say, I haven't seen evidence, but I reckon if you surveyed men and women in the armed forces and veterans themselves, it would be overwhelming. 80%, 90% would not want a Welcome to Country on Anzac Day.
I agree with you.
Insulting. You're welcoming soldiers back. So I don't think it's a politically contentious position to say let's not do that on Anzac Day. Look, it's virtue signalling. Tony Abbott in recent days has come out and said that. You know, he suggested that the party really should have taken a harder line on it, as I suggested earlier, and I think he's right. You know, I think Australians are sick of the division of this sort of virtue signalling stuff, which is shoved down people's throats. You know, I think the Prime Minister this week, in the final debate, he said, people can choose whether to do it or not. But that's not the reality of the situation. It's everywhere. Even when you land in a plane in Qantas, you get it. I mean, I was shocked when I got back from the US in January for the first time. in a few years. And when the plane landed, there was a welcome to country. I thought, what is going on? This is very strange. And then, of course, I've had it for every Qantas flight since. So it's the country has changed rapidly culturally, and my view is that's not all for the best, and I think probably most people share that view.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there, Adam. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk to you about former Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, because in news that should surprise no one, he is a liar. He lied to our faces constantly during those painful, lengthy press conferences where he claimed that he was imposing the world's toughest lockdown restrictions due to medical advice.
There will be a curfew on advice from the Chief Health Officer from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. each and every day. That comes into effect from tonight. I'm asking people to curfew from 9 p.m. The rules don't kick in until midnight, but I'm asking people to observe that curfew from 9 p.m. tonight. From 11:59 p.m. this evening, all of these changes will become effective. The curfew, obviously, because it's at 9 p.m, we'd ask people to observe that from 9 p.m, even though it doesn't come into legal effect until just before midnight tonight. That is on direct advice from the Chief Health Officer, and he'll be the next to speak, and he can explain to you why he's provided that advice and more.
Yeah, what a hero. I mean, locking Victorians in their homes, destroying businesses, plunging the state into debt, sparking really a dark and very real mental health crisis in Victoria. And it's now been revealed that the decision to force millions of people to live under a curfew was not based on health advice. Documents obtained by the Herald Sun reveal that the curfew was proposed without any formal input from health authorities. So Dan Andrews, he has the nickname as Dictator Dan, and that couldn't be more true. Adam, you're in Melbourne. How are Melburnians feeling now this truth has finally come out? A truth I think we all suspected, and it has been revealed.
Well, look, fortunately, I was in the US during the worst of that lockdown in Victoria, and I've been living here for the last few months, and I think people are really scarred by the experience. Kind of when they do talk about it, I think they're ashamed. It's a mix of shame and embarrassment about what happened, and I think this is, this just really worsens the wound, this new story that's come out that suggests, as I expected at the time, I was writing about it for America, writing about it from afar, but, the idea the health advice said to lock down people in general, let alone between specific hours of 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. was always complete nonsense. It was just there because certain politicians enjoyed the sick exercise of power. I think that's all it was. It was all about politics. It wasn't about health science. It was about political science. And the devastation, I mean, as a result, it's just extraordinary. I mean, I hope people never forget what Victoria went through with the quarantines and the shutdown of certain apartment blocks, the destruction of people's human rights for hundreds and hundreds of days, and their death outcomes were worse than any other state. So what does that say about the effectiveness of lockdowns? I mean, it was a shameful episode in Australian history, and the Western world more generally, I would say, but particularly Victoria. There was no health advice. There was no pandemic plan that had been written in any Western country ever that suggested to lock a population down because of a virus ever, and yet we did it, and we did it because we wanted to copy communist China. I don't want to rant about this, it's one of my pet topics, but it's just it just made me angry listening to that press conference of him lying back. I assume that was 2021. I mean, the height of the man, and well, I think there's been other reports that he doesn't like going outside now in Victoria, and that probably goes to to the fact that he gets screamed at quite occasionally.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember living in Melbourne through the horrific COVID period, attending many of those press conferences. And I tell you what, the anger was very much alive then. I remember going to press conferences that were rarely held outside, but I went to a couple that were, and there were people heckling and shouting, and there's so much anger. And of course, there would be when he was putting Melburnians through, such horrific circumstances, things that people shouldn't have to live through, taking away so many freedoms. But over in the US, Donald Trump is not going to let Americans forget about the lies that we were all told during the COVID pandemic. The Trump administration has overhauled the official covid.gov website into a website that reads Lab Leak, displaying evidence that COVID came from a lab in Wuhan, China. And the website also names Anthony Fauci as a person who wanted to cover this up. And it points out how damaging lockdowns were to not only the economy, but the mental and physical health of Americans. Now, this, of course, would have been better 5 years ago, but I love that Trump has done this. It is an important reminder that we should not forget what we all went through 5 years ago, and it's important that it's out there.
No, look, it really is, and you know, just to what we were discussing earlier. I mean, with the lockdowns in general, if you look at the US, it was states like Florida and Texas that did the least, and states like California and New York that did the most in terms of lockdowns, but their death outcomes are actually the same. So these extremely destructive policies were not effective, and yet they are extremely socially and economically damaging. The same is true in Europe. If you look at Sweden, that country ended up with the lowest excess deaths in all of Europe, and yet it's the only country that did not do a lockdown. So again, you know, it does suggest quite obviously to anyone who's, you know, who has an IQ over 50 that lockdowns were not particularly effective and yet were extremely destructive. So look, it's great the Trump administration has put that up finally. And the issue of the lab leak too, I mean, how extraordinary. You know, that was the obvious explanation from the start, right? You had this virus leak in the only city in China where there was a viral institute that actually looked at viruses like that, like COVID, and yet people were like, "Oh no, it definitely didn't come from the lab."
Not possible.
It goes to show you the power of propaganda. It goes to show you the power of propaganda. The whole mainstream media basically fell in line behind that nonsense.
Absolutely.
And Anthony Fauci, who you mentioned, I mean, he commissioned research which was, you know, meant to say that a lab leak was impossible. Of course, now we know that was all propaganda. It was all corruption, and it's so great that's all come out. The sad thing about all this is that a big chunk of the population, you know, have basically lost total respect for so-called experts. You know, in the health departments, you know, health authorities, scientists have seen how corrupt the whole process can be, and this is a bit scary because if there's actually a serious pandemic next time, and in my view, COVID should not have been considered a serious pandemic, but if there's a real pandemic, then no one's going to believe what we're told. That's a
exactly
problem.
Right. Absolutely. Well, we have to look at those countries like Sweden that you mentioned and other states in the US that didn't lock down and had better or the same outcomes. That has to be a lesson or something we can take away for next time, when there is a next time, which could be more serious than COVID. But Chief Economist at the IPA, Adam Creighton, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us on Power Hour. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me.